why the McCanns would sedate the twins on May 3rd if there was a stage event happening?
Well, because it's the best of two evils. The handwritten timelines, which Matt said was written over a day or two, were in fact rehearsal sheets of what who needed to do and when. So imagine the twins waking up during those crucial hours of the play. It would ruin the whole plan.
For nearly 2 decades, one question has haunted the world. Did Madeleine McCann really disappear on the night of May 3rd, 2007? Or does the truth belong to a different moment in time, concealed from the very beginning? The headlines told a story everyone could understand. A stranger slipping into apartment 5A in Praia da Luz, a 3-year-old girl taken while her parents dined with friends nearby. That was the tale splashed across front pages, broadcast through breaking news alerts, repeated in tearful press conferences. But behind the flashbulbs and sound bites, a darker and far more unsettling possibility lingered in the shadows. Bernt Stellander, a retired military police officer from Norway, was never convinced by the official script. He did not chase the silhouette of a faceless kidnapper. He did not lose himself in theories of trafficking rings or wandering predators. Instead, he asked the question few dared to even whisper. What if Madeleine had never been taken away at all? What if she never left Praia da Luz? And if that was true, then what happened to her small, fragile body? For years, Stellander sifted through every statement, every timeline, every overlooked inconsistency. He combed the testimonies of friends who dined with the McCanns, scrutinized media interviews, and studied forensic files with a soldier's discipline. Where others saw grieving parents, he saw measured performances. Where others accepted coincidence, he noticed patterns. And in those patterns, he believed, the truth lived, not in dramatic proclamations, but in subtle contradictions, in actions that spoke louder than words. From that conviction grew an unusual investigation. Stellander planted hidden cameras in the Portuguese hills, sent cryptic anonymous emails, and documented the smallest rituals that others ignored. He didn't ask, who kidnapped Madeleine? His question was sharper, heavier. Was she buried here, in plain sight, while the world looked elsewhere? This is not the story the newspapers told. This is not the polished narrative repeated in televised interviews. This is the story silence tried to bury. To follow it, we must be willing to peel back the official timeline, to consider that May 3rd might not have been the night of tragedy at all. It might have been something else entirely, the night the performance began. One of the most unsettling conclusions drawn by Bernt Stellander was that the timeline, the very foundation upon which the entire Madeleine McCann case rested, was flawed from the start. To the world, May 3rd, 2007 was the night of tragedy, but to Stellander, it was the night of performance. He believed the real turning point had happened 24 hours earlier, on May the 2nd. This was not an idea born out of wild speculation. It was born out of contradictions, out of words that didn't quite match actions, and out of behaviors that rang false when studied through the eyes of someone trained to read human psychology. Stellander sifted through hundreds of pages of testimony from the Tapas 7, the group of friends who vacationed alongside the McCanns in Portugal. What he found was not a neat puzzle, but a web of subtle contradictions. Times didn't align, memories shifted. Dinner arrangements were described differently depending on who was asked. The order of child check-ins seemed rehearsed, too tidy, almost as if designed to hold together under questioning rather than reflect messy human recall. Most striking of all were the behaviors of Kate and Gerry McCann themselves. Parents experiencing fresh trauma typically move in shock, their words and gestures disjointed, their emotions raw. What Stellander observed on May 3rd and in the days that followed, however, felt too composed, too practiced. The narrative of abduction was rolled out quickly, cleanly, and with a consistency that seemed unlikely for a family blindsided by sudden catastrophe. Then came a chilling detail, an overlooked phrase in Kate McCann's personal diary. In one entry, she described May the 2nd as the night of all nights. For a mother who claimed her daughter was taken the following evening, this choice of words raised alarms. Why mark May 2nd with such gravity if the true horror occurred on May 3rd? To Stellander, this was not a slip of the pen. It was a leak of truth through language. Words, unlike spontaneous emotions, go through reflection. They are chosen. And in that choice, he saw something deeper. That May 2nd was the real night of crisis, and May 3rd was the day the story began. What then could have happened on that earlier night? Stellander's theory suggested the possibility of an accident, perhaps a medical emergency, perhaps the use of sedatives gone wrong. In the investigation files, there is mention of Madeleine crying persistently on May the 1st, unable to sleep. That same evening, Kate reportedly called a doctor friend for advice. Did that conversation touch on medication? Did an attempt to soothe the restless children with sedatives result in unintended tragedy? These questions were never answered in the official record, yet their existence cast long shadows over the accepted timeline. If Madeleine had indeed died on May 2nd, everything that unfolded on May 3rd, the so-called check-ins at the apartment, the story of the open shutter, the frantic media appeals, would not be reactions to abduction, but elements of a carefully constructed performance, a narrative designed to redirect attention, to create a controlled origin point for the tragedy, one that placed the McCanns firmly as victims and stripped away the possibility of culpability. The more Stellander examined the McCanns' actions, the more he saw rehearsed behavior rather than raw grief. Kate and Gerry did not collapse into despair. They mobilized press conferences. They spoke in unison, reinforcing each other's statements, presenting a united front. Their story had no cracks, even when cracks seemed natural. And yet, beneath that surface, inconsistencies bubbled. Who saw Madeleine last alive? At what exact time? Which door was used to enter or leave the apartment? These questions never received answers that aligned perfectly. Instead, they received answers that sounded rehearsed, repeated, and polished for outside ears. For Stellander, the cumulative weight of these contradictions pointed to one conclusion: that May 3rd was not the night Madeleine vanished. It was the night a cover story was born. The truth, he argued, was buried one day earlier, on May the 2nd, a night remembered by Kate as the night of all nights, a phrase that echoed louder than any press statement, louder than any public appeal. In his view, the case was not about who might have slipped into the apartment on May 3rd, but what may have already transpired inside it 24 hours earlier. A shift of one day perhaps, but one that changed everything. Because if Madeleine had died on May 2nd, the accepted narrative, the frantic dinner checks, the alarm raised in the middle of the evening, the search parties that combed the seaside town, all of it was theater, built not to find a missing child, but to cover the loss of one who could never be found. The investigation took an even stranger turn when a dream was introduced into the narrative. In June 2007, just weeks after Madeleine's disappearance, Kate McCann allegedly confided to a police liaison that she had dreamt her daughter was buried on a hill overlooking the sea. On its own, such a dream might seem like nothing more than a grieving mother's subconscious struggling to process unbearable loss. But for Bernt Stellander, the words were a signal, a clue hiding in plain sight. What unsettled him most was not the dream itself, but Gerry McCann's reaction when asked about it later. He flatly denied it ever happened. His exact words: "It's not true that Kate had a dream she was buried somewhere." To most, this would sound like a routine rebuttal, but to Stellander, the language was chilling. Gerry used the word buried, not gone, not taken. Buried, a word that suggested permanence, a body, a place. To Stellander, this choice of words felt less like a dismissal and more like a preemptive denial. It sounded like fear, not confusion. From that moment, Stellander began to suspect that the McCann story was not one of abduction at all, but one of concealment. He wondered whether a body had been hidden, not by strangers, but by those closest to her. And so, he followed the trail of Kate's dream, up into the hills overlooking Praia de Luz. There, on a quiet slope facing the Atlantic, he discovered something he could not explain away. Arranged on the ground was a heart-shaped pattern made of stones and petals. Nearby, branches had been laid out in the shape of an M. Beside them rested a freshly placed pink flower with no obvious origin. To Stellander, these were not random arrangements left by nature. They were deliberate. They were personal. They were intimate signs of mourning. In his years of training, Stellander had learned a crucial distinction. Innocent people, those who lose loved ones in accidents or tragedies, often avoid the place where it happened. It is too painful, too overwhelming. The guilty, however, or those burdened by unresolved responsibility, tend to return. They revisit the place, not to hide, but to reconnect. They are drawn back to the scene, tethered by guilt. He began to watch the site, which he labeled Spot 1. He installed hidden cameras, camouflaged among rocks and brush, to see if anyone would come back. At first, nothing. Days passed, weeks. The hill remained still. But then, one day, movement appeared on the feed. A lone figure walked into frame. It was Gerry McCann. The sight left Stellander shaken. Gerry wasn't there with the media, not there with his other children, not there for a public vigil. He was alone, deliberate. His presence had no logical explanation if he truly believed his daughter had been abducted from their holiday apartment. Why would a father who insisted his daughter was taken be walking alone on a remote hill marked by symbols tied to her name? Unless, Stellander thought, he already knew what was there. He decided to test his theory further. He crafted an anonymous email, vague yet urgent, designed to sound like the message of a co-conspirator. It read simply, "It's about to be discovered. We can delay them a week." He didn't say what it was. He didn't threaten. He only implied knowledge. His aim was not deception, but observation. How would they respond? The answer came quickly. Within 2 weeks of sending the email, Stellander's camera captured Gerry again, this time with Kate. They arrived quietly, preceded by a family friend who appeared to scout the area before signaling it was safe. Once again, there were no children, no journalists, no flowers, just presence. Quiet, deliberate, specific. To Stellander, this behavior was not mourning. It was control. Innocent parents, he argued, would have taken the email to the police, desperate for any lead. They would have demanded a search, pleaded for answers. Instead, the McCanns returned in secrecy, verifying the site themselves, as though ensuring something remained hidden. It was here that Stellander developed a concept he called romanticizing the grave. In his view, when parents are entangled in guilt through negligence, error, or worse, they sometimes create rituals around the place of loss. They transform it into a shrine, not only to the child, but to their own failed guardianship. It becomes a site of penance, a way to rewrite the narrative of their role from passive perpetrator to grieving protector. Kate's later solitary visits to Spot 1 only reinforced his suspicions. His cameras caught her jogging near the hill, often alone, sometimes carrying a crumpled photo of Madeleine in her hand. In one frame, she stood motionless, arms wrapped tightly around herself. In another, she placed a small object on the ground and lingered before leaving without a word. These were not the actions of a mother clinging to hope that her child was alive somewhere. They were the actions of a mother returning to a grave in disguise. To Stellander, Spot 1 was more than just a patch of earth. It was a diary written in stones and petals, a place where silence spoke louder than any press conference. If May the 2nd was the night of tragedy, then Spot 1 was the stage of its aftermath, a hidden chapter, visible only to those who knew where to look. If the contradictions of May the 2nd and the eerie rituals at Spot 1 weren't troubling enough, what came next would send even deeper shockwaves through Bernt Stellander's investigation. It began with what seemed like a mundane decision. 25 days after Madeleine was reported missing, the McCanns rented a car. On May 27, 2007, Gerry and Kate signed the papers for a Renault Scenic at a local rental agency in Portugal. At first glance, nothing about this seemed extraordinary. Families need cars, especially when living under the scrutiny of journalists, police, and tourists. But for Stellander, the timing raised questions. Why would grieving parents who insisted their child had been abducted and whisked away long before suddenly need a vehicle nearly a month later? If Madeleine had been taken by strangers, as the official story declared, what possible connection could a new car have to her disappearance? That question took on chilling significance when two highly trained dogs were introduced to the case. Eddie, a cadaver dog, was known across Europe for his precision in detecting the scent of human decomposition. Kayla, a blood detection dog, specialized in finding microscopic traces of human blood invisible to the eye. Both were handled by Martin Grime, a veteran in forensic canine work with a history of reliable results in high-profile investigations. When brought to the Renault Scenic, Eddie reacted instantly. He alerted strongly at the trunk of the vehicle, signaling the unmistakable presence of cadaver scent. Moments later, Kayla confirmed by detecting traces of human blood in the same area. For Stellander, this was no longer a question of speculation. This was behavior, science, and scent converging in one place. The samples collected from the car were later tested. The results were unsettling. 15 out of 19 DNA markers matched Madeleine McCann's profile. The degraded and mixed nature of the material prevented a full match, leaving room for debate. But to seasoned investigators, a partial match of that magnitude was far too significant to dismiss as coincidence. Yes, some experts argued, DNA within a family can overlap, but decomposition and blood traces discovered in a car rented weeks after the disappearance, that was something else entirely. Stellander began to connect the dots with his military-trained logic. What if Madeleine's body had not been removed immediately after her death, but hidden temporarily in a discreet location, somewhere unlikely to be searched, perhaps a cemetery or an isolated coastal area? What if, after weeks of intense media attention and police presence, the McCanns finally had the opportunity and the means to move her remains to a more permanent site? The timeline aligned too perfectly. 25 days of waiting, then the sudden rental of a car, followed by the forensic dogs detecting exactly what one would expect if a body had been transferred. Adding to his suspicion was a detail so small it might have been overlooked. Kate McCann washing Madeleine's beloved toy, Cuddle Cat. For weeks after the disappearance, Kate was often photographed clutching the stuffed animal, holding it close as though it were a lifeline to her missing child. But then, inexplicably, she decided to launder it. To most parents of missing children, every belonging becomes sacred, preserved in the hope that their child will return to it one day, or to protect potential forensic evidence. Washing the toy, especially so soon, erased both. Kate explained that it smelled bad. To Stellander, the reasoning rang hollow. He considered the darker possibility. If the toy had been in contact with Madeleine after her death, it might have absorbed the scent of decomposition. Washing it could have been an unconscious attempt to erase a sensory reminder, or a deliberate act to remove incriminating traces. Either way, it didn't align with the natural behavior of a parent still hoping for her child's return. Individually, each of these elements, the late car rental, the alerts of the dogs, the partial DNA match, the washing of Cuddle Cat, might be argued away as circumstantial, but taken together, they formed a disturbing pattern. Behavior, Stellander believed, was evidence. And in this case, the behavior was not consistent with innocence. Parents convinced their child was abducted would not need a car weeks later. They would not be linked to cadaver scent. They would not launder a cherished toy that held the last physical trace of their missing daughter. These were not the acts of desperate parents searching for hope. These were the acts of individuals navigating a secret too heavy to admit. For Stellander, the Renault Scenic was not just a car. It was a vessel of truth. It carried within its fibers and upholstery the quiet echoes of what had really happened. Whispers of decomposition, strands of DNA, the kind of evidence that cannot be silenced by press conferences or public sympathy. It was, in his view, one of the most chilling pieces of the entire case, not because it proved guilt beyond doubt, but because it shattered the narrative so completely. And once shattered, the official story could never be pieced back together the same way again. Even beyond the timeline inconsistencies, the strange hilltop rituals, and the damning forensic suspicions, there were other moments in the McCann story that disturbed Bernt Stellander. These weren't large revelations, but small, almost mundane choices. Yet, to a trained investigator, they carried the weight of hidden meaning. One such moment came in May 2007, only 2 weeks after Madeleine was declared missing. A photograph circulated in the press, Gerry McCann and his close friend David Payne jogging up a hill near Praia da Luz. Behind them stood the church where the family had held vigils, its cross rising against the sky. To the public, the image was reassuring. It was framed as a portrait of resilience, two fathers running together, staying strong in the face of despair. It looked like hope. But to Stellander, the symbolism was too calculated. Why that particular hill? Why so public? Why so soon? He believed it was not simply exercise, but a performance, a deliberate embedding of themselves into the landscape. By jogging openly in that location, Gerry and David were normalizing their presence there. Later, If they returned under less public circumstances, their earlier visibility could be cited as a harmless precedent. "We've run here before, everyone knows that," would become an alibi of familiarity. His suspicion deepened when he read Gerry's blog post about the jog. Instead of pouring out grief or raw emotion, Gerry described the run in peculiar detail: the incline of the road, the duration, even the number of minutes it took to reach a marker point on the hill. He claimed it took 19 minutes. Intrigued, Stellander decided to test it himself. He retraced the same route with a stopwatch. Even at a steady, unhurried pace, he completed it in 12. The 7-minute discrepancy was odd. Was it a mistake? Or was it an attempt to fix a timeline, to shape reality to fit a story? Stellander recognized the pattern. In crisis psychology, those who fear exposure often flood their surroundings with excessive detail, overloading the narrative with specifics in order to drown out scrutiny. By writing about his jog in almost clinical terms, Gerry was not grieving. He was anchoring a narrative, one that could later deflect questions. But the behavior that haunted Stellander most was quieter, stranger still. Kate McCann's decision to repeatedly visit the hillside, known as Spot 1. His hidden cameras captured her presence there, sometimes jogging past, sometimes pausing in stillness, sometimes placing small objects, wilted photographs, flowers, even toys, on the ground. These visits were never announced. There was no media. She came alone, without her surviving twins, without friends, without witnesses. For Stellander, this was not the behavior of a mother hoping her daughter was alive somewhere. It was the behavior of someone tethered to a grave. He coined the term silent pilgrimage to describe it. Innocent parents, he argued, avoid the sites of tragedy. It is too painful, too crushing. Those bound by guilt, however, return, not to seek answers, but to make peace with what they already know. Kate's visits were not acts of public advocacy. They were private rituals of grief, consistent, repetitive, precise. Not the randomness of a wandering mourner, but the movements of someone who remembered exactly where to go. Stellander compared her behavior to other cases he had studied. Time and again, he had seen the same pattern. Mothers implicated in their children's deaths returning secretly to the place of loss, unable to sever the connection. Their presence there was not about justice, but about atonement. It was guilt disguised as mourning. Together, these acts, the symbolic jog, the over-detailed blog post, the solitary visits, formed what Stellander called controlled visibility. They weren't random gestures. They were strategic choices, rehearsed behaviors designed to project strength, normalcy, or innocence. But in the context of the broader case, they felt too staged. To him, they were less about coping and more about performance. "A grieving father may run," Stellander once wrote, "but he does not script his route for the public. A grieving mother may light candles, but she does not repeatedly sneak back to an anonymous hillside marked by symbols of her child's name. These were not the actions of parents consumed by the search for a missing daughter. They were the actions of people managing a secret, protecting a silence too heavy to confess." For all the contradictions, the suspicious visits, and the forensic anomalies, perhaps the most haunting element of the Madeleine McCann case is not what was said, but what was never said. For 17 years, the group known as the Tapas 7 has maintained an unbroken wall of silence. From 2007 until today, not one of them has meaningfully revised their statements about the night of May 3rd. Not a single detail, not a single timeline has shifted. To the casual observer, this might seem like unity born of truth, but to Bernt Stellander, it was something far stranger. In his experience, small lies can last a few days. Big lies, especially those requiring multiple people to maintain them, rarely survive a few years. Memories slip, pressure mounts, details fray. Yet here, despite contradictions about who checked the children, when doors were opened, and which path was taken, the story has remained eerily consistent. It is as if it was carved in stone. Stellander asked the question no one seemed willing to confront: why hasn't anyone broken ranks? His answer was unsettling. He believed the silence was not born from loyalty, but from fear. Many of the Tapas 7 were doctors or respected professionals. To admit even a minor untruth, misstating a time, fabricating a room check, could have destroyed their reputations, their careers, their lives. Worse still, any admission of dishonesty might have implicated them in obstruction of justice, perjury, or even complicity in a cover-up. Under that weight, silence became survival. But Stellander also recognized another force at work, the psychology of shared trauma. He believed that some among the Tapas 7 might have seen or suspected more than they admitted. Perhaps they heard something on May 2nd. Perhaps they noticed signs on May 3rd. But once the official narrative was set, that Madeleine vanished during the night of May 3rd, they became trapped. To speak up later would mean confessing not just what they saw, but why they had remained silent for so long. That kind of admission would transform them from witnesses into accomplices. And so, year after year, they stayed quiet. He called it psychological entrapment. In this state, even those who were not directly involved in a crime become prisoners of their own silence. By repeating the same account over and over, their memories shift from subjective recall to a collective script. They no longer simply cover up, they begin to believe. This phenomenon, known in forensic psychology as contaminated memory, is powerful. People can convince themselves of a version of events simply because they have told it enough times, especially in a group bound together by pressure and guilt. For Stellander, this explained the eerie uniformity of their testimonies. They weren't just reciting a lie. They were living inside it. Their silence was not a pact of friendship. It was a prison of fear. 17 years is a long time. Relationships falter, loyalties shift, but fear endures. And Stellander believed that fear is what kept the Tapas 7 bound together in their silence. Not the fear of one another, but the fear of what would unravel if even one thread was pulled. They're not protecting a person, Stellander once wrote. They're protecting a shared silence. In his eyes, the Tapas 7 may not all know exactly what happened to Madeleine, but they know enough to understand that to revise their story now, even slightly, would collapse everything. Careers would crumble, families would be ruined, and the fragile wall that has shielded them for nearly 2 decades would finally fall. It is this silence, not the absence of forensic proof, not the lack of a body, that Stellander found most haunting. Because silence, in the right context, can be louder than any confession. When Madeleine McCann vanished from apartment 5A in Praia da Luz in May 2007, the world froze. A missing child ignited an international manhunt. Millions of pounds were spent. Countless theories filled headlines, and endless hours of news cycles turned her face into a global symbol of loss. Yet, today, almost 2 decades later, there is still no body, no clear suspect, and no definitive answers. But Bernt Stellander argued that perhaps the answers were never hidden in locked police files or buried in courtroom transcripts. Perhaps they were always there, in plain sight, in the silences, in the small rituals, in the behaviors that no one wanted to study too closely. For him, the case was never about confirming guilt with a single piece of evidence. It was about listening to what human behavior reveals when words fail. Kate washing the stuffed toy her daughter slept with. Erasing possible DNA when most grieving parents preserve such items untouched. Gerry writing obsessively detailed notes about a jogging route when most fathers in crisis barely manage to speak through tears. The couple returning quietly to a lonely hill marked by symbols of their daughter's name, never alerting the police, never bringing the media, never taking their other children with them. These were not the behaviors of parents clinging to hope for a missing child. They were, in Stellander's view, the behaviors of parents tethered to a secret too devastating to admit. Time itself became his framework. He argued that May 3rd, the date the world remembers, was not the night of tragedy, but the night of storytelling. The real crisis, he believed, unfolded on May 2nd, a date Kate herself called the night of all nights. Shift the tragedy back just one day, and the entire narrative changes. The frantic checks, the open shutter, the media appeals, all of it becomes a carefully staged cover for something that had already happened. And then there is the silence. 17 years of unbroken consistency from the Tapas 7, despite contradictions in detail, despite glaring improbabilities. Stellander concluded that this was not loyalty, but fear, not protection of a person, but protection of a collective silence. A silence that could never be broken without shattering careers, reputations, and identities. What makes this story so haunting is not what is known, but what remains deliberately unspoken. Without a body, there is no crime. Without a confession, there is no closure. But silence itself can be a prison, one built not with bars and locks, but with fear and complicity. Stellander never claimed to know precisely what happened to Madeleine. He never pointed to a single smoking gun. Instead, he offered a mirror, one that reflected not what people said, but what they did when they thought no one was watching. He believed that truth is often written in small gestures, in the rituals repeated when cameras are gone, in the choices people make to erase or to conceal. In that sense, the hill, the car, the toy, the silence, all became chapters of a story the world was never meant to read. The Madeleine McCann case may never be resolved in a court of law. The absence of a body, the contamination of the crime scene, and the passage of time have left too many gaps to bridge with certainty. Yet the lessons it leaves behind remain powerful. It shows us how fragile justice can be when silence is weaponized, how quickly a narrative can overshadow evidence, and how behaviors, quiet, routine, overlooked, can whisper truths louder than any official statement. Perhaps that is the most devastating realization, that the tragedy of Madeleine McCann may not be just her disappearance, but the silence that has followed her ever since. A silence heavy enough to bury the truth. A silence powerful enough to outlast 17 years of questions. And in the end, Stellander leaves us with a question that refuses to fade. If Madeleine never left Praia de Luz, what was it that the world was really searching for all these years? A missing child, or a story carefully rehearsed to hide the unbearable?